He is on death row for killing an off-duty Orangeburg police officer in 2004. He will be the fifth inmate executed since South Carolina restarted the death penalty last year. So far, Governor McMaster has not granted any stays of executions. His execution date is set for April 11th.
He chose the bullets. Not the needle. Not the electric chair. The bullets. In a state where execution chambers had gone silent for over a decade, the sound of gunfire returned, loud, unmistakable, final. 40 days later, a second man stepped forward. He didn't plead. He didn't flinch. He asked to die the same way. His name is Mikal Mahdi. You may not recognize it. His face doesn't appear on T-shirts or posters. There are no documentaries built around his childhood. No crowds outside the courthouse. But what he did, and what led him to that cold, concrete room, where 5 men with rifles waited, each with a bullet, one of them real, cannot be ignored. This isn't a story about what's right or wrong. It's about what happened. In July of 2004, the summer was heavy in the Carolinas. The kind of heat that sticks to your skin, presses on your shoulders. People went about their days as usual. Grocery lists. Morning commutes. Evening barbecues. Life carried on. But in a small gas station in Winston-Salem, a man walked in, pulled a gun, and ended another man's life. His name was Christopher Boggs. 29 years old. He was working the late shift. Alone. Surveillance caught the killer's entrance, the slight hesitation before he raised the weapon, and then, a flash. It was over in seconds. The motive? Barely anything. He walked out with a single can of beer. 2 days later, 180 miles away, another man died. This time, it was James Edward Myers, a retired police officer. A man respected in his community. Found on his property. Shot. Burned. His body unrecognizable. The flames devoured everything but the horror they left behind. The man responsible for both killings didn't run far. He crossed into Florida. He didn't hide. He drove the stolen truck belonging to one of his victims. Windows down. Music playing. Like nothing had happened. And when the police caught up with him, he didn't deny it. He told them what he did. Flatly. Without emotion. This is where our story begins. Before the courtrooms. Before the headlines. Before the long years spent in a concrete box waiting for a sentence to be carried out. Before the question, why would someone choose to be executed by firing squad? There are answers. But they're buried. In court transcripts. In scorched earth. In the eyes of the families left behind. And in the silence between each pull of a trigger. Stay with us. This is the real story. July 15, 2004. It was just after midnight when Christopher Boggs clocked in for his shift at a convenience store in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. He was used to the solitude, the late-night regulars, the hum of fluorescent lights, the steady ding of the entry chime. He never saw the man walk in with a gun. There was no shouting. No demands. Just a single, deafening shot. One round fired into his chest. Christopher collapsed behind the counter. The gunman didn't even bother to open the register. He took a beer. That was it. Security footage later revealed the calmness. The kind of stillness that doesn't come from fear or confusion, but from a man who had already made up his mind. The city didn't have time to react before another tragedy struck. Just 2 days later, across state lines in South Carolina, James Myers spent the morning tending to his land. A former officer with decades of service behind him, he had retired to a quiet life. His home sat on acres of rural property in Calhoun County, peaceful, quiet, removed from the chaos of the city. But that morning, he wasn't alone. Mikal Mahdi knew what he was doing. He had watched Myers. Waited. Then, when the moment came, he stepped forward and opened fire. Shot after shot. Then, silence. But Mahdi didn't stop there. He dragged the body. Poured gasoline. Lit the match. The fire consumed everything: clothing, hair, skin, identity. By the time first responders arrived, there was little left but ash and suspicion. Something didn't fit. It wasn't random. This was personal. Calculated. And then the truck was gone. Myers' vehicle, a dark Ford pickup, disappeared from the property. For days, police across 2 states compared notes. One man dead in a store for no clear reason. Another, a retired officer, murdered and burned on his own land. The only link? A suspect who seemed to move without fear, without hesitation, and without any clear destination. They didn't find him in a hideout. He wasn't buried in the woods or sleeping under a fake name. He was on a highway in Florida, behind the wheel of the stolen truck, windows down, music on, alone. Police approached with guns drawn. Mahdi didn't resist. He didn't speak. When asked why he ran, he shrugged. When asked why he killed, he offered no explanation. But his record, it had spoken long before he did. From a young age, Mahdi was in trouble. He bounced between group homes, juvenile detention centers, and probation offices. Reports described a boy quick to anger, slow to trust. He'd been arrested before, for burglary, assault, threats. But nothing like this. At his trial, the court tried to understand what had happened in those 2 days in July. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer. The defense, overwhelmed and underprepared, barely argued back. In South Carolina, where the murder of James Myers had shaken the law enforcement community, the judge wasted no time. Circuit Court Judge Clifton Newman, measured, experienced, and calm, delivered the sentence: death. The courtroom sat still. No outbursts. No tears. Mahdi stood motionless. Years later, in North Carolina, he would face charges for Christopher Boggs' murder. This time, he pleaded guilty again. But there was no death penalty in the state. The sentence was life without parole. 2 lives. 2 sentences. 1 man. The years crawled by. Mahdi remained on South Carolina's death row. Appeals came and went. Lawyers argued ineffective counsel. They spoke of childhood trauma, mental health diagnoses, emotional instability. But the courts did not waver. Not once. From 2006 to 2023, every appeal was denied. Then, something changed. In 2021, South Carolina made headlines. Lethal injection drugs had run out. The state, unable to carry out executions, reinstated the firing squad and the electric chair as primary methods. The decision ignited debate nationwide. Human rights organizations condemned it. Lawmakers defended it. The people were divided. For a decade, no one had been executed in South Carolina. Until Brad Sigmon. On March 7, 2025, at Broad River Correctional Institution, Sigmon faced the firing squad. 5 marksmen stood behind a wall. Their rifles aimed through small openings. One rifle was loaded with a blank. The rest with live ammunition. None of the shooters knew which gun carried the fatal round. The process was silent. Clean. Final. 40 days later, Mikal Mahdi requested the same. He waived further appeals. Rejected the electric chair. Declined lethal injection, even if it became available. He wanted bullets. People asked why. Why choose a death so visual, so violent? But Mahdi gave no reasons. His attorneys begged for clemency. They spoke of trauma. Of a young man born into chaos. A mind twisted by years of neglect, abandonment, and violence. They argued his trial attorneys never presented key mitigating evidence. That his life was thrown away long before he ever picked up a gun. But it didn't matter. The state had heard enough. They pointed to the coldness, the brutality, the second-degree burglary, the theft, the arson, the execution-style killings. They said justice needed to be done. And so, the date was set. April 11, 2025. 5 men will take position behind a wall. Mahdi will be strapped to a chair, a target placed over his heart. A black hood over his head. When the warden gives the signal, they will fire. One shot, then another. Then silence. Some will call it closure. Others will call it cruelty. But no one will say it didn't happen. Long before the gunshots, before the flames lit up the Calhoun County sky, before the mugshots, the press conferences, the final meal, there was a boy. Mikal Mahdi was born into instability. His early life never made headlines, but it left a mark. Those who knew him, teachers, social workers, even childhood neighbors, would later describe a boy who barely spoke, who lashed out when cornered, who watched everything but rarely let anyone in. There were no birthday parties. No holiday pictures. No one cheering him on at school events. Just incident reports. Just warnings. Just more paperwork. He grew up bouncing between foster care and juvenile facilities. Some tried to help. Others gave up quickly. At 14, he was already known to police. At 16, he was accused of threatening another teen with a knife. By 18, he was in and out of detention centers. And somewhere in those years, something hardened. The crimes escalated. The punishment followed. And yet, no one stopped him. No one paused to ask what path this young man was on, or what might lie at the end of it. By 2004, Mahdi was 21. That summer, he seemed untethered. He had no fixed address, no consistent job, no close friends. He moved through the world like someone already preparing for the end. And in July, he began his final stretch. First came the robbery in North Carolina. Christopher Boggs, a soft-spoken, well-liked clerk, was working the night shift at a gas station off Reynolda Road. He had dreams. He was saving money. He had a fiancée. All of that ended in seconds. What the public never knew was that Mahdi didn't run immediately. After killing Boggs, he stayed in the area. Bought more alcohol. Slept in the woods. He didn't try to cover his tracks. He didn't panic. And that stillness, chilling in hindsight, made it clear, this wasn't desperation. This was decision. Then, on July 17, he crossed into South Carolina. James Myers had recently retired. Years of service on the local force had earned him respect and peace. He bought land in Calhoun County, built a quiet life, and spent his mornings tending to it. That day, he was alone. There were no witnesses. No neighbors nearby. When Mahdi struck, no one was around to stop him. He fired multiple rounds. The exact number remains sealed, but what investigators found was chaos, blood, shattered glass, a home ransacked. Then the fire. Accelerants were used. The fire was set in 2 places, designed to consume everything quickly. When investigators arrived, they couldn't even confirm the body as Myers until days later through dental records. The truck was missing. And inside the house, nearly every trace of the killer's presence had been reduced to ash. But he left one thing behind, an impression. A method. A signature. The kind of brutality that doesn't happen by accident. Back in North Carolina, investigators started connecting dots. A man seen near the convenience store. A vehicle leaving the scene. Ballistics. Surveillance. A name. Mikal Mahdi. A bolo was issued. But he was already gone. He drove Myers' truck south. Days passed. No calls. No texts. Nothing. But on July 21st, 4 days after the second murder, officers in Florida spotted the truck at a gas station outside Jacksonville. The plates matched. They approached with weapons drawn. He didn't resist. He didn't say much at all. They brought him in. He sat silently during booking. When asked about the murders, he gave short answers. Then, finally, a full confession. No emotion. No explanation. Just facts. Yes, I killed Boggs. Yes, I shot Myers. Yes, I burned the body. It stunned even the most experienced detectives. Mahdi was extradited back to South Carolina first. The trial didn't last long. The evidence was overwhelming. Witnesses described the wreckage. The forensics team laid out bullet trajectories, burn patterns, and the trail of evidence left behind. The jury didn't deliberate long. But what stood out most was the sentencing hearing. Mahdi's defense team barely pushed back. They called no psychological experts. No family members. They offered no narrative of abuse, no evidence of mental illness, no plea for mercy. Their mitigation lasted less than 30 minutes. In capital cases, defense presentations can take days. Sometimes weeks. For Mahdi, it was half an hour. And so, when Judge Newman handed down the death sentence, no one was surprised. He cited the cruelty of the act. The lack of remorse. The premeditation. And with a slow, deliberate voice, he said the words that sealed Mahdi's fate. He would be executed by the state of South Carolina. Years later, North Carolina followed suit. For the murder of Christopher Boggs, Mahdi received life without parole. By then, he was already on death row in Colombia. What followed was a long, slow march. Years in isolation. Years of appeals. Motions filed, reviewed, denied. Each year passed like molasses. Inmates around him grew old. Some died of illness. Others took their own lives. But Mahdi remained, unchanged, unreadable, unmoved. Then came 2021. The state announced it could no longer obtain lethal injection drugs. The pharmaceutical companies refused to sell. So lawmakers introduced something else. The electric chair. And, for the first time in modern history, the firing squad. Legal battles erupted. Lawsuits were filed. Inmates argued the methods were barbaric. Inhumane. Outdated. But the courts sided with the state. If the drugs were unavailable, executions had to proceed. By early 2025, South Carolina had prepared its chamber. Reinforced concrete walls. A metal chair. 5 trained shooters. Rifles loaded. Targets marked. On March 7, Brad Sigmund became the first to face them. Mahdi was next. He was given a choice, electric chair or firing squad. He chose the latter. No appeals. No delays. His attorneys made one last effort for clemency. They released documents showing a deeply unstable childhood. Medical records indicating dissociation. Traumatic head injuries. Neglect. But the governor declined to intervene. So, the countdown began. April 11th. He would be led into a chamber. He would be strapped to a chair. A black hood would be lowered over his face. A target, small, red, unmistakable, would be pinned over his heart. 5 shooters. 4 live rounds. 1 blank. None would know which rifle held the false shot. They would raise their weapons. They would wait for the command. And when it came, they would fire. This is how a life ends. Not with a crowd. Not with last words written in ink. But with silence, smoke, and a red stain on gray concrete. The story of Mikal Mahdi didn't make national headlines. There were no documentaries until now. But his case holds a mirror to something we don't often want to see. What happens when justice demands more than a verdict? What happens when a man walks toward the bullets, eyes open, hands steady? And what does it say about all of us, when the state pulls the trigger? There are no easy answers. Only facts. And they are final. He will choose the bullets. Not the needle. Not the chair. Not a quiet death behind a curtain, out of sight. He will walk into a room where 5 men stand ready, rifles in hand. He will sit down. He will not resist. He will not ask for mercy. And when the order is given, he will die. On April 11, 2025, South Carolina prepares to carry out its second firing squad execution in just over a month. The man is Mikal Mahdi. The public barely recognizes his name. But those who remember July 2004, who followed the murders, the manhunt, the arrest, know exactly who he is. They know what he did. And now, they are watching to see how it ends. He has waited nearly 2 decades for this. For years, he lived in a concrete cell, surrounded by the routines of the condemned. Meals slid through a slot. Showers under supervision. Letters censored. No visitors. Just time, slow, steady, silent. There is no appeal pending. No clemency granted. Mahdi has made his decision. And the state has confirmed it. He will be executed by firing squad. This is not speculation. This is not dramatization. This is real. In a room deep inside Broad River Correctional Institution, preparations are already underway. The rifles are selected. The marksman chosen. The execution chamber cleaned and re-inspected. The timeline rehearsed down to the second. At noon on April 11, the sequence begins. They will bring him out. He will be led down a short hallway, shackled, surrounded by guards. He will see the chair, metal, bolted to the floor. He will sit. He will be strapped in, wrists, ankles, chest. A target will be pinned to his heart. He will be given a chance to speak. If he chooses to remain silent, the room will fall still. The warden will signal. The rifles will rise. 5 shooters behind a wall. 4 live rounds. 1 blank. None of them knowing which one carries death. They will aim. And they will fire. That moment, violent, clinical, irreversible, will be the conclusion of a story that began long before that summer in 2004. But that moment hasn't happened yet. Right now, Mahdi waits. He sits in a small cell reserved for the condemned. The lights are brighter. The checks more frequent. The guards more alert. This is Death Watch. Every hour is documented. Every step logged. He is allowed a last meal. He is allowed to write letters. He is allowed to request a spiritual advisor. So far, he asks for nothing. The state has released no indication of remorse. His legal team has submitted his background as part of a clemency effort, a file thick with childhood trauma, psychological evaluations, accounts of abuse and abandonment. They argue he was never truly defended in court. That his sentencing hearing lasted less than 30 minutes. That no one spoke for his life. The governor has not responded. Outside the prison, protesters are beginning to gather. Some stand in support of the victims' families. Others hold signs against capital punishment. The news cameras are already there. Satellite trucks. Reporters rehearsing their lines. The last execution drew national headlines. This one will, too. Inside, Mahdi keeps to himself. He reads. He writes. He sleeps. He has not spoken publicly. He has not given an interview. But the finality of his choice speaks for him. This is the second time South Carolina will use the firing squad since its reauthorization. The first came just 40 days earlier. Brad Sigmund. His name, too, faded from memory quickly. But the procedure was documented, the process reviewed. And now, it will be repeated. This is the world we live in. A state. A man. A moment. 5 rifles. 1 heart. And the silence that follows. The story is not finished. But in just a few days, it will be. You've heard the facts. You followed the path, from crime to capture, from courtroom to execution chamber. Now ask yourself. Is this justice? Is the firing squad a step forward, or a return to something we thought we left behind? Does a man like Mikal Mahdi deserve the death penalty, or did the system fail long before he ever pulled a trigger? What do you believe? Comment below. Tell us, was the sentence fair, or was something overlooked? Share this video. Let others see the full story, unfiltered, unedited, and real. And if you want more stories like this, deep, honest, and haunting, subscribe now. Because this isn't the last time justice will look like this. And the questions, they're only just beginning.